Everyone thought the WNBA players finally had leverage. They had the numbers. They had the noise. They had the headlines. And for a brief moment, it felt like the balance of power had shifted. But then something strange happened. The strike threat didn't explode into chaos. It didn't force emergency concessions. It didn't spark panic behind closed doors. Instead, it slowly, quietly collapsed. Not because owners suddenly became ruthless. Not because the league played hardball. But because the one thing the players were counting on stopped working. Behind all the bold statements and social media confidence, there was an unspoken assumption holding everything together. An assumption so fragile that once it cracked, the entire strategy unraveled in real time. The players believed they had somewhere else to go. They believed walking away was a real option. They believed the league needed them more than they needed the league. And for a while, everyone else played along. But markets don't respond to belief. Networks don't negotiate with vibes. And leverage doesn't exist just because a lot of people agree it should. What happened next exposed a hard truth no one wanted to say out loud. The strike didn't fail at the table. It failed long before negotiations ever reached a breaking point. It failed the moment the backup plan stopped looking real. And once that happened, every demand, every threat, and every show of unity lost its weight. Because when leverage disappears, reality moves fast. And to understand how the WNBA players ended up here, you have to go back to the exact moment everyone thought this was finally their turning point. At first, the strike talk felt different. This wasn't quiet frustration leaking through interviews. This wasn't anonymous sources hinting at tension. This was loud, public, and nearly unanimous. Reports started circulating that roughly 97% of WNBA players were prepared to strike if a new agreement wasn't reached. That number mattered. It wasn't just symbolic. It was meant to signal total unity. Unity is powerful in labor disputes. Or at least it looks powerful. The messaging was clear and consistent. Players were done accepting deals they felt didn't reflect their value. They were done waiting patiently. They were done trusting that growth would eventually trickle down. This time, they were standing together. This time, they were willing to shut it all down. And the media loved it. Headlines framed this as a historic moment. A long overdue reckoning. A sign that women's basketball had finally reached the point where players could demand more and expect to get it. Social media amplified every statement. Every quote was treated like proof that the league had entered a new era. Fans were told this wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about recognition, about fairness. And because those ideas resonate emotionally, they spread fast. Anyone questioning the strategy was framed as missing the bigger picture. Anyone asking how the numbers would work was accused of focusing on the wrong thing. But here's the part that didn't get enough attention. A strike threat only works if the other side believes you can survive the consequences longer than they can. And in this case, that belief depended entirely on one question. If the WNBA players walked away, where exactly were they going? Early on, players spoke with confidence. They referenced new opportunities, alternative leagues, better deals waiting on the other side. The implication was obvious. The WNBA wasn't the only option anymore. The power dynamic had changed. That idea didn't come out of nowhere. It had been carefully built over time. For years, players were told the sport was exploding, that interest was growing, that the audience was expanding beyond traditional boundaries. They were shown rising social engagement, viral clips, and highlight reels pushed endlessly across platforms. They were told that this visibility would eventually translate into leverage. So when strike talk began, it felt like the natural next step. If the sport was truly growing the way everyone claimed, then walking away shouldn't be terrifying. It should be strategic. But growth narratives can be misleading. Visibility doesn't always equal demand. And attention doesn't always turn into revenue. Behind the scenes, the league stayed calm. There was no public panic. No emergency concessions. No frantic messaging. That silence wasn't confidence. It was calculation. Owners and executives weren't reacting emotionally because they were waiting on something far more important than tweets or press conferences. They were waiting on proof. As negotiations dragged on, something subtle started to happen. The tone shifted. The certainty softened. Players who once spoke in absolutes began adding qualifiers. Instead of "we will strike," it became "we're prepared to strike." Instead of firm deadlines, there were extensions. Instead of ultimatums, there were discussions about flexibility. None of this was accidental. The longer this went on, the clearer it became that the strike threat wasn't pressuring the league the way everyone expected. And that raised an uncomfortable question. If nearly the entire workforce is threatening to stop, why isn't the employer blinking? The answer wasn't cruelty. It wasn't arrogance. It was leverage, or more accurately, the lack of it. Because a strike only works if stopping production hurts the other side more than it hurts you. And the league understood something the players were just beginning to realize. The real test wasn't whether players were willing to strike. It was whether they could afford to. That's when attention quietly shifted to the supposed safety net, the alternative path. The place players believed would catch them if they fell. And once that spotlight turned on, everything changed. Because if that backup plan wasn't real, then the strike was never going to work in the first place. And that realization was about to hit harder than anyone expected. Unrivaled wasn't just another startup league. At least, that's how it was sold. On the surface, it was framed as opportunity, freedom, a long overdue correction to a system that players felt undervalued them. But beneath all the branding and optimism, Unrivaled served a very specific purpose in this moment. It wasn't meant to replace the WNBA overnight. It was meant to exist just enough to change the math of negotiations. Because leverage doesn't require dominance. It only requires credibility. As long as Unrivaled looked viable, WNBA players could sit across the table knowing they weren't trapped. They could threaten to leave. They could slow negotiations. They could demand more aggressive terms. The league would have to respond, not because it wanted to, but because losing talent to a competitor, even a small one, creates uncertainty. That uncertainty is powerful. Players talked about Unrivaled like it was insurance. Even if it didn't surpass the WNBA, it didn't have to. It just had to survive. It just had to prove there was another place where players could earn meaningful money and still stay visible. As long as that was true, the WNBA couldn't fully call their bluff. And for a while it worked. Media outlets amplified the narrative hard. Unrivaled was framed as proof that women's basketball demand had reached a tipping point. Articles praised innovation. Commentators framed it as inevitable. The message was clear. This wasn't a gamble. This was the future arriving early. That perception mattered more than reality at first. Players didn't need Unrivaled to be wildly profitable. They needed it to look stable. They needed networks to take it seriously. They needed sponsors to stay involved. As long as those boxes were checked, leverage remained intact. This is where things get dangerous. Because when a negotiation strategy depends on appearances, it becomes fragile. One crack is all it takes. One set of numbers. One missed expectation. One moment where optimism meets accountability. And that moment was always coming. Behind the scenes, Unrivaled had the same problem every startup league faces. Payroll was high. Promotion was expensive. And attention, while loud online, wasn't guaranteed to translate into viewers sitting down and watching full games. But none of that mattered at first, because belief filled the gaps. Belief that interest would grow. Belief that curiosity would turn into loyalty. Belief that media hype would eventually become habit. The problem is, belief doesn't pay broadcast partners. As negotiations with the WNBA continued, Unrivaled quietly became the centerpiece of the entire standoff. It wasn't officially part of the talks, but everyone knew it was there. Every demand made sense only if Unrivaled remained credible. Every refusal only worked if walking away was realistic. Owners knew this. Executives knew this. And most importantly, networks knew this. That's why the league didn't rush. That's why they didn't overreact to strike rhetoric. They understood that time itself was a test. If Unrivaled could hold its audience, hold its sponsors, and hold its narrative, then pressure would increase. If it couldn't, leverage would evaporate. So they waited. And then the numbers arrived. Not opinions. Not narratives. Not explanations. Just raw viewership data. And in one release, the illusion started to collapse. Because the drop wasn't small enough to spin. It wasn't gradual enough to explain away. It wasn't ambiguous enough to debate. It was sudden, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. A 65% decline doesn't start conversations. It ends them. In that moment, Unrivaled stopped being a threat and started becoming a liability. What was supposed to strengthen the player's position now raised uncomfortable questions. If this was the alternative, how long could it really last? If this was the future, why were fewer people showing up than before? And once those questions surfaced, leverage began bleeding out fast. Because if Unrivaled couldn't sustain attention, then walking away from the WNBA didn't look bold anymore. It looked risky. And in negotiations, risk without upside isn't power. It's exposure. The strike strategy was built on the idea that players had options. But options only matter if they're real. And with every rating report, that reality looked weaker. What was meant to be the ace in the hole was suddenly the weakest card in the deck. And once that became clear, the entire balance of the negotiation shifted. Because now, the league wasn't negotiating against confidence. They were negotiating against fear. And what happened next is the exact moment leverage officially died. When the viewership numbers dropped, there was no dramatic announcement, no press conference, no emotional reaction. Just a quiet release that did more damage than any headline ever could. A 65% drop. Not a slip. Not a fluctuation. Not a down year. A collapse. This wasn't the kind of decline analysts argue over. It wasn't something you could blame on scheduling, marketing, or timing. A drop that large doesn't raise questions. It answers them. It tells you, clearly and without emotion, how much demand actually exists when hype fades and curiosity wears off. And suddenly, Unrivaled wasn't being talked about as leverage anymore. It was being talked about as a warning. Because here's the part that changes everything. Negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. Every conversation taking place between players and the league was happening while executives, sponsors, and broadcasters were looking at the same data. And those numbers didn't just weaken the player's position. They rewrote the entire risk calculation. Networks don't invest in hope. Sponsors don't fund potential. Owners don't cave to narratives. They respond to evidence. A 65% decline told them something brutal but important. Whatever audience showed up at launch wasn't growing. It was shrinking. And worse, it was shrinking fast. That meant Unrivaled wasn't just struggling to expand. It was struggling to hold the people who already cared enough to tune in once. That's the most dangerous signal any media product can send. Because early adopters are supposed to be loyal. They're supposed to stick around through rough patches. When even they disappear, it suggests the product isn't converting interest into habit. And without habit, there is no sustainable league. This is where the math becomes unavoidable. Unrivaled wasn't cheap to run. Player salaries were high. Promotion costs were massive. Broadcasting on major platforms isn't charity, it's an investment. Every viewer shortfall widens the gap between money going out and money coming in. So when the ratings dropped off a cliff, the conversation behind closed doors shifted instantly. Instead of asking, "How do we grow this?" the question became, "How long can this survive?" And that question matters more than anything players were saying publicly. Because leverage isn't about making noise. It's about creating pressure. And pressure only exists when the other side feels threatened by your alternatives. Once Unrivaled stopped looking stable, it stopped being threatening. That's when the strike threat lost its teeth. Players could still talk tough. They could still posture. They could still insist they were united. But unity without a safety net isn't strength, it's exposure. And everyone involved knew it. This is the moment the power dynamic flipped. Before the numbers, the league had to consider the risk of players leaving. After the numbers, the league knew exactly what that risk looked like. And it didn't look scary. It looked limited, temporary, manageable. A league bleeding viewers isn't a refuge. It's a countdown. Once executives saw that, patience became the winning strategy. There was no need to rush. No need to overpay. No need to concede to demands that didn't align with reality. Time itself became leverage, just not for the players. And the players felt it. You could hear it in the language. Statements became less absolute. Confidence became conditional. The conversation quietly moved from "when we strike" to "if negotiations continue." That shift didn't happen because players changed their beliefs. It happened because the math changed the consequences. When Unrivaled's numbers fell, every threat carried less weight. Every demand felt more hollow. And every delay favored the league more than the players. Because now, the league knew something crucial. If players walked, they weren't walking toward opportunity. They were walking toward uncertainty, toward a shrinking platform, toward a business model that was already showing signs of strain. And in negotiations, uncertainty doesn't scare the side with deeper pockets. It scares the side with fewer options. That's why the strike stopped feeling inevitable. Not because anyone officially backed down, but because everyone could see the cliff. And once that cliff appeared, The conversation stopped being about fairness or respect or long-term vision. It became about survival. Because when leverage disappears, reality doesn't negotiate. It dictates. And what came next was the clearest sign, yet that the players had lost the upper hand, even if no one wanted to admit it out loud. Leverage is one of the most misunderstood ideas in sports business. People treat it like a feeling, like confidence, like unity. But leverage isn't emotional. It's mechanical. It either exists or it doesn't. And in this case, it didn't. Real leverage only comes from one place: the ability to hurt the other side more than they can hurt you. That's it. Everything else is noise. Social pressure doesn't count if the financial risk is low. Public opinion doesn't matter if the numbers don't move. Even unity means nothing if the alternative is worse than the current deal. That's where the WNBA players miscalculated. The strike threat assumed that stopping play would force the league into a corner. But that assumption only holds if the league can't tolerate the disruption. And once Unrivaled's collapse entered the picture, it became clear the league could tolerate far more than the players could. Because the WNBA doesn't operate like most leagues. It's not surviving on ticket sales alone. It's not dependent on short-term ratings to stay alive. It's been subsidized for decades. That insulation changes everything. When a league knows it can weather a pause, a slowdown, or even a short-term disruption, strike threats lose potency. They stop being emergencies and start becoming waiting games. And the league was perfectly positioned to wait. Players, on the other hand, weren't. Most WNBA players don't have the luxury of sitting out indefinitely. Careers are short. Windows are narrow. Income streams aren't guaranteed. Missing seasons doesn't just delay money. It risks relevance. That imbalance matters. A lot. Once Unrivaled faltered, the players' fallback option disappeared. That meant striking no longer carried upside. It only carried cost. And when one side faces rising costs while the other side faces inconvenience, leverage shifts instantly. This is the part that doesn't get talked about publicly. Negotiations aren't won by who's right. They're won by who can afford to wait. And once the league realized the players had nowhere else to go, time became its greatest weapon. Every week without a deal hurt the players more than it hurt the league. Every delay weakened resolve. Every passing moment turned solidarity into stress. Because bills don't pause, careers don't pause, and momentum doesn't pause. Meanwhile, the league could sit quietly, let emotions burn off, and allow reality to do the heavy lifting. This is why the tone changed. What started as demands slowly turned into discussions. What began as ultimatums softened into proposals. The strike threat didn't disappear overnight, but it lost its edge. It stopped being a weapon and became a last resort no one really wanted to use. And that's when leverage officially died. Because the moment both sides know a threat won't be executed, it stops being leverage at all. It becomes theater. The league didn't need to call the bluff. The numbers already did that. Once Unrivaled lost credibility, every player knew the truth, even if they didn't say it publicly. Walking away didn't mean freedom. It meant instability. It meant gambling on something already trending downward. And that's not power. That's desperation. This is the difference between perceived leverage and real leverage. Perceived leverage is loud. Real leverage is quiet. And once the quiet side realizes the loud side can't follow through, the negotiation is effectively over. The strike was never officially canceled. It didn't need to be. It collapsed under its own weight. The league didn't win by force. It won by waiting. And by understanding something crucial. The players needed the system more than the system needed them. That realization set the stage for the next shift. The one where players began preparing for a reality they had already lost control over. Because once leverage vanishes, the only move left is damage control. And that's exactly where this story was headed next. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no announcement saying the strategy had failed. No admission that leverage was gone. Instead, it showed up in the small things. In the wording. In the pauses. In what players stopped saying. Early on, everything was definitive. Statements were framed as lines in the sand. The message was simple: accept our terms or we walk. That confidence was contagious. It fueled fan support. It reinforced the idea that the players were finally unified and unafraid. But after the numbers dropped, that certainty began to erode. Conversations quietly moved away from striking and toward continuity. Instead of emphasizing what the players demanded, discussions began focusing on what they could tolerate. Instead of deadlines, there were extensions. Instead of confrontation, there was caution. This is what damage control looks like before anyone admits it's happening. Publicly, players maintained solidarity. Privately, the calculus changed. Every player had to ask themselves the same uncomfortable question. How long can I actually afford to wait? Because once Unrivaled stopped looking like a safety net, waiting stopped being strategic and started being risky. The old CBA, once described as insulting, suddenly didn't sound so unbearable. The same terms that were dismissed as unacceptable began reappearing in conversations as temporary solutions. Not ideal, not fair, but familiar, stable, safe. That reversal mattered more than most people realized. Because negotiating power doesn't just disappear, it inverts. The moment players began signaling a willingness to play under the old agreement, the league gained leverage it didn't even have to ask for. Why rush to improve a deal when the other side is preparing to accept the one already on the table? From the league's perspective, the message was clear. The strike threat had lost credibility. Players were blinking first. And that didn't make the league aggressive. It made them patient. Patience is brutal in negotiations. It forces the other side to confront reality on its own timeline. And the longer this dragged on, the more the pressure shifted inward, away from the league and onto the players themselves. Unity is easy when optimism is high. It's harder when uncertainty creeps in. Some players have endorsement deals. Others don't. Some can afford to wait. Others can't. Those differences don't disappear just because everyone wants the same outcome. This is where solidarity starts to fracture, even if no one says it out loud. Because while players continued presenting a united front, individual incentives began pulling in different directions. For stars with outside income, waiting was inconvenient. For role players, it was existential. Missing games meant missing checks. Missing seasons meant missed opportunities that might never come back. That imbalance quietly weakened the group. Meanwhile, the league didn't need to apply pressure. It just had to stay still. Every day without progress pushed the players closer to the same conclusion. Striking would hurt them more than it would hurt the league. And once that realization settles in, negotiations stop being about winning. They become about minimizing loss. That's why conversations shifted toward compromise. Why playing under the old CBA started sounding reasonable. Why the language around standing firm softened into keeping the season going. The players weren't surrendering. They were adapting to reality. But that adaptation came at a cost. Because the moment you move from demands to damage control, you've already lost the upper hand. You're no longer shaping the outcome. You're reacting to it. And in business, reaction is weakness. This wasn't a moral failure. It wasn't betrayal. It was the predictable result of a strategy built on an assumption that didn't hold. Once the backup plan collapsed, everything else followed. And yet, there was one factor that made this reversal even more uncomfortable. A name that kept coming up, whether people wanted to talk about it or not. Because at the center of all this was a star whose success didn't lift the entire league the way many expected. And that reality was about to force the most difficult conversation of all. Caitlyn Clark wasn't supposed to be a problem. She was supposed to be proof. Proof that women's basketball had arrived. Proof that the audience was finally here. Proof that stars could move numbers, drive interest, and change the economics of the sport. For a while, that belief felt justified. Her games drew attention. Her highlights traveled. Her name became recognizable even outside basketball circles. But recognition isn't the same as replication. As negotiations dragged on, Clark's success began revealing an uncomfortable truth instead of hiding it. Interest wasn't spreading evenly. It was concentrating. Ratings didn't rise across the board. They spiked in very specific places and fell everywhere else. That distinction matters more than people want to admit. Because leagues aren't built on outliers. They're built on ecosystems. One star can bring eyeballs, but only if the rest of the product holds attention once those eyeballs arrive. Otherwise, all you have is a spotlight surrounded by darkness. Clark became the measuring stick. When she was on the screen, people showed up. When she wasn't, the audience dropped. That pattern didn't just challenge narratives, it shattered them. The assumption had been that her popularity meant the entire league's value had risen. That her success was transferable. That if one player could draw, others would follow. But that's not how markets work. Star power isn't contagious by default. Instead of lifting all boats, Clark exposed the gap between perceived demand and actual demand. Networks could see it. Sponsors could see it. Executives could see it. And once they did, negotiations took on a completely different tone. Because now, the league wasn't negotiating as if every player was equally valuable. It was negotiating based on evidence, on performance, on who actually moved the needle. That created tension. Players weren't wrong to believe Clark's emergence mattered. It did, but they were wrong to believe it automatically justified across-the-board demands. The market doesn't pay for symbolism. It pays for results. And Clark's results told a narrow story. When Unrivaled struggled to draw viewers, even with recognizable names involved, it reinforced that story. The problem wasn't visibility. It was retention. It wasn't promotion. It was habit. This is where expectations became dangerously inflated. Media coverage had spent years framing women's basketball as undervalued rather than underconsumed. That framing encouraged players to believe demand was being suppressed, not absent. So when Clark broke through, it felt like confirmation, like the dam had burst. But the flood never came. Instead, interest surged around one player and stalled everywhere else. And that reality made collective bargaining far more complicated. Because how do you negotiate shared value when the value isn't actually shared? This wasn't Clark's fault. And it wasn't an indictment of other players' talent. It was a market reality colliding with a narrative that had gone unchallenged for too long. And once that collision happened, it changed the math. The league could justify targeted investment. It could justify star-focused promotion. But it couldn't justify revenue-sharing demands based on a level of demand that didn't exist. Especially not when alternative leagues were proving unable to sustain even modest audiences. Clark's success didn't weaken the player's case intentionally, but it unintentionally exposed the flaw at its core. The league wasn't growing uniformly. It was peaking selectively. And that distinction made the most aggressive demands impossible to defend. Because if only one player consistently draws, then the market will treat everyone else differently, no matter how unified they appear. This is the problem no one wanted to talk about, because it fractures the idea of collective power. It forces uncomfortable conversations about individual value, and it undermines the belief that solidarity alone can overcome economics. But once the numbers are out, those conversations can't be avoided, and they led directly to the most unrealistic demand of the entire negotiation, the one that finally broke the illusion and made compromise inevitable. Up until this point, the debate could still be framed emotionally, about fairness, about respect, about what players felt they deserved. But one proposal dragged the conversation out of the emotional realm and forced it into pure math. Gross revenue. That single word changed everything. The players' demand for a percentage of gross revenue wasn't just ambitious, it was revealing. Gross means before expenses, before travel, before marketing, before salaries, before losses are accounted for. It assumes the league is profitable simply because money flows through it. And that assumption didn't match reality. The WNBA has operated at a loss for most of its existence. That's not an opinion. That's history. Subsidies from the NBA kept it alive. Not explosive demand. Not massive TV deals. Support. So when players pushed for a share of gross revenue, executives didn't hear confidence. They heard detachment. Because agreeing to that structure would lock in losses regardless of performance. It would turn hope into obligation. From a business standpoint, it was unworkable. Net revenue, what remains after expenses, is how struggling leagues survive. It aligns incentives. It forces everyone to care about sustainability. Gross revenue ignores risk entirely. That's why this demand quietly ended serious negotiations. It wasn't because the league didn't want to pay players more. It was because the proposal required pretending losses didn't matter. And no amount of pressure or solidarity can force investors to accept a model that guarantees red ink. Once this proposal hit the table, the spell broke. The conversation stopped being about growth potential and started being about damage limitation. Executives could no longer treat the demands as aspirational. They had to treat them as dangerous. And this is where the players' earlier assumptions came back to haunt them. The belief that demand was being suppressed led to demands that assumed profit. But the numbers showed otherwise. And when Unrivaled struggles reinforced those numbers, there was nowhere left to hide. The league had already offered what it considered a reasonable compromise, a larger share of net revenue. That offer acknowledged losses while still providing upside if growth actually materialized. But it wasn't enough for players who believed the value was already there. That gap in perception became the real barrier. Players believed they were negotiating over distribution. The league believed it was negotiating over survival. Those two mindsets don't meet in the middle easily. And once it became clear the league wouldn't move on gross revenue, players faced a choice. Continue pushing for something that wouldn't happen, or accept a deal grounded in reality. That's when urgency replaced confidence. Because time was no longer neutral. Every delay increased uncertainty. Every missed season hurt players far more than it hurt the league. And with no viable alternative league applying pressure, the cost of waiting became obvious. This wasn't a moral judgment. It was arithmetic. Gross revenue demands exposed the mismatch between belief and reality. They forced everyone to confront the difference between wanting a system to work and having one that actually does. And once that confrontation happened, the narrative of inevitable player victory collapsed. What remained was a quieter, more uncomfortable truth. The market wasn't lying. It was just refusing to pretend. And as that truth settled in, another gap became impossible to ignore. The widening distance between the story fans were told and the reality the numbers revealed. That gap would soon define how this entire situation was remembered. For years, the story around women's basketball followed a familiar script. Interest was surging. Visibility was skyrocketing. Growth was described as inevitable, delayed only by outdated systems and unfair treatment. The implication was always the same. The audience was there, it just needed to be unlocked. That story mattered. Because stories shape expectations. And expectations shape negotiations. Media outlets repeated the language, so often it became accepted truth. Growth wasn't framed as a question anymore, it was treated as a fact. Anyone asking for proof was accused of bad faith. Anyone pointing to ratings was told they were missing the cultural moment. But culture doesn't pay broadcast bills. When the Unrivaled numbers dropped, it exposed the gap between narrative and reality in a way that couldn't be smoothed over. Promotion had been massive. Coverage had been generous. Platforms had been secured. If interest was truly there, this was the moment it should have shown up. It didn't, and that forced an uncomfortable reckoning. Because the problem wasn't awareness. People knew these games existed. The problem wasn't access. They were available on major networks. The problem wasn't talent. The athletes were elite by any objective standard. The problem was demand. Demand isn't created by messaging. It's revealed by behavior. By who shows up when nothing is being forced. By who stays when novelty fades. And once the novelty wore off, the audience made a clear choice. That choice contradicted years of confident storytelling. The media had confused attention with attachment. Social engagement with commitment. Headlines with habits. Those things look similar on the surface, but they behave very differently when tested. This is why markets are brutal. They don't care about intention. They don't care about fairness. They don't care about how badly something deserves to work. They respond only to what people actually do. And what people did was tune out. That doesn't mean the product had no value. It means the value was narrower than advertised. Smaller, more fragile, and far less scalable than negotiations assumed. This is where the strike narrative truly lost credibility. Because once the market spoke, the league didn't need to argue. It didn't need to justify its position. It could simply point to the numbers. Every demand could be weighed against evidence instead of emotion. And that's devastating in negotiations. Players weren't negotiating against owners anymore. They were negotiating against behavior they couldn't control. Against audiences that didn't show up the way the story promised they would. That's why media framing suddenly shifted. Coverage became quieter, less triumphant, more cautious. The language softened. Growth was no longer guaranteed. It was conditional. Progress was no longer inevitable. It was aspirational. Because the market had embarrassed the narrative. And once that happened, the illusion that pressure alone could force change disappeared. You can shame executives. You can pressure sponsors. You can dominate headlines for a news cycle. But you can't guilt millions of people into watching something they don't prioritize. That's the line no amount of messaging can cross. The strike was built on the assumption that the market would back the players once forced to choose. Instead, the market shrugged. And in doing so, it removed the final piece of leverage the players thought they had. What remained was a system that had been misread for years. A league mistaken for a movement. Attention mistaken for demand. and belief mistaken for power. And once those mistakes were exposed, the conversation shifted again, away from who was right and toward who had misunderstood the system itself. Because the biggest failure here wasn't individual. It was structural. And that's where this story truly ends up. By the time everything was laid bare, it became tempting to point fingers. Some blamed the players for overreaching. Others blamed owners for not doing enough. But that framing misses the real issue entirely. This wasn't a failure of ambition. It wasn't a failure of unity. And it wasn't even a failure of effort. It was a failure of expectations created by the system itself. For decades, the WNBA existed in a unique space. It wasn't fully independent, but it wasn't treated like a temporary project either. Subsidies from the NBA kept it alive through years of losses. That support was necessary, but it also created a dangerous side effect. It blurred the line between sustainability and protection. When a league survives regardless of demand, it becomes harder to tell where the real limits are. Players grew up inside that environment. They were told growth was coming. They were told patience would be rewarded. They were told that visibility would eventually convert into leverage. And when those things didn't materialize fast enough, frustration was inevitable. That frustration wasn't unreasonable. But the system never forced a reckoning until now. As long as losses were absorbed quietly, expectations could inflate without consequence. As long as narratives went untested, belief could replace proof. And as long as alternatives like Unrivaled looked viable, players could imagine a world where the rules suddenly changed. The problem is that imagined leverage doesn't survive contact with markets. When Unrivaled failed to hold attention, it didn't just weaken negotiations. It exposed how dependent the entire ecosystem was on support rather than demand. And once that truth surfaced, the system stopped protecting players from reality. That's why this moment feels so harsh. The players weren't wrong to want more. They were wrong to believe the structure could deliver it on command. The system trained them to expect growth without proving it. And when proof was finally required, it wasn't there. This isn't about blaming athletes for believing what they were told. It's about acknowledging that long-term insulation can distort perception. When survival isn't tied to performance, it becomes easy to confuse stability with strength. The strike didn't fail because players lacked courage. It failed because the environment that shaped their expectations didn't match the environment they were negotiating in. And once those two worlds collided, the outcome was inevitable. Because systems don't bend to belief forever. Eventually, they demand receipts. So where does this leave the WNBA now? The strike threat is effectively neutralized. Not officially canceled, but strategically hollow. The old CBA, once dismissed outright, is back on the table, not as a victory but as a lifeline. And future negotiations will happen in a very different tone than before. The league knows it can wait. The players know they can't bluff. That changes everything. This doesn't mean growth is impossible. It means growth has to be earned the hard way, through sustained demand, not assumed momentum. It means future leverage won't come from narratives or alternatives that look good on paper. It will come from proving that audiences stay when the hype is gone. And that's the real lesson here. Belief can start movements, but markets decide outcomes. Visibility can open doors, but retention keeps them open. And solidarity can amplify voices, but it can't replace leverage. The WNBA still has an opportunity, but it's narrower now, more defined, less forgiving. And any future progress will have to be built on evidence, not expectation. Because once the illusion breaks, there's no going back to pretending. And if you want real, unfiltered breakdowns like this, the kind that go deeper than headlines and don't repeat the same talking points, make sure you subscribe. This story isn't done, and when the next chapter drops, you'll want to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes.